Hello, everyone. I'm Patrick Holden, Sustainable Food Trust, also a dairy farming and cheese making in West Wales. And it's my pleasure, great pleasure actually, to introduce our speaker for this session, Nicolette Hahn Niman, who I met something around 10 years ago in California and has become a good friend. Nicolette, welcome. And what a great thing it is that you're joining us for this sesh. What a shame we couldn't be physically together, but where are you? You're on the East Coast, aren't you?
Well, strangely, I'm in Florida at the moment. It's unusual for me. Normally, I would be in California, just north of San Francisco.
Yeah. Nicolette, you've undergone at least 3 major transitions that I know about, maybe many more, but you grew up, I think, in Michigan, didn't you? Is that right? Yes. And then you transitioned to California. You also transitioned from being a lawyer, and a very eminent lawyer at that, to becoming a passionate advocate of regenerative and sustainable agriculture and sustainable livestock in particular. And you transitioned from being a vegetarian to an omnivore. And of course, that's going to feature in what we're about to hear from you, I suspect. Your influence is global. Defending Beef, the 2nd edition of which has just recently been published, is a must-read book. I'm really excited that you're with us, and I'm going to hand the floor over to you. And what the form is, I think you're going to speak to us with some PowerPoint stuff for about 45, and then we're going to, maybe I can bring up some issues that you've already raised, and then we're going to open the floor. So Nicolette, over to you.
Thank you, Patrick. And it is a tremendous pleasure for me to be here today, and especially to be hosted by my good friend, Patrick. I wanted to say a few more words about my background before I start, because I know when I'm listening to a talk, I want to know who's talking to me. So for those people who don't know much about me, I want to explain a little bit about my background. As was mentioned, I grew up in the upper Midwest of the United States, in Michigan, and I studied biology in college, and then I went on to study law, and I became a lawyer, and I was working first as a prosecuting attorney and then in private practice as a lawyer when I saw a speech by Robert F. Kennedy Jr., which inspired me to pursue the career of working as an environmental lawyer for nonprofit environmental groups. And first I was a lawyer for National Wildlife Federation, and then I took a job directly with Bobby Kennedy Jr. As the senior attorney for Waterkeeper Alliance in New York. During those 2 years that I worked for him and for that organization, my work focused entirely on the pollution and other problems from the meat industry, the large concentrated industrial meat industry specifically. And it was during that time that I began understanding. I had already been a vegetarian at that point for well over 10 years, and I had a fairly simplistic view about animals in the food system and meat as a food. And it was at that juncture, when I started working on it full-time professionally, that my such much deeper dive into the topic started. And after the 2 years I was working there, and during that time I met a lot of farmers and ranchers. I traveled around the United States and saw dozens of farms of all types. I also toured many industrial livestock operations and flew with my good friend Rick Dove, flew in airplanes above many of them in North Carolina and elsewhere. And I began to see a very different picture depending on how farming was done. And I met many of the farmers in the Niman Ranch Network, and also Bill Niman, the founder of the Niman Ranch Network of Farmers and Ranchers, which is a network in the United States of several hundred, 700 to 800 farmers and ranchers that are in that are all following traditional practices. And I ended up leaving the Waterkeeper Alliance job after a couple of years, and I ended up moving from New York, where I was working, to California and marrying Bill Niman, the founder of the Niman Ranch Network. So my life took a very unexpected turn and transition at that point, from being a sort of a vegetarian lawyer living in New York City and working full-time against the meat industry, to someone who was living in California on a ranch and working, not initially, but eventually I became someone who got very involved in the ranch, and I was actually working on the ranch. I did not become an omnivore until many years later. I've been married to my husband now for 18 years. And during that time period, I was a vegetarian up until just 2 years ago. So I spent 33 years of my life as a vegetarian, including 16 years living and working on a ranch. And it wasn't until recently that I began eating meat again. So what I'm going to do today is I'm going to talk about, that's kind of my background, so you understand who's speaking to you and what my biases and my experiences and knowledge it comes from. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to present this issue as I see it in terms of this very specific question, but it's a very big question of, do we even need animals in the food system? Because there's a pretty strong current of thought right now suggesting that we shouldn't even be eating or raising animals anymore. And the last 20 years of work that I've been doing in this space has convinced me of exactly the opposite, that the animals are crucial to truly building an ecologically vibrant food system. With that, I'm going to begin sharing my screen. Hopefully this will work. And I have a PowerPoint presentation. And then, as Patrick said, we will move into a discussion after the presentation. Great. So I called this talk The Real Food Solution because I increasingly am beginning to see this issue as one of industrial food and farming versus foods that our bodies have evolved to eat, and farming that is in concert and in harmony with nature. And so I view that as really being about real food, creating real food and consuming real food, and why these things are important. And I'll be explaining why I think animals are so essential to that. Okay, so everyone on this Zoom presentation is probably quite familiar with these issues. So I'm going to go through some of these slides quite rapidly because this is a very educated audience. But this is just my quick summary. Conventional industrial agriculture, so that which dominates in the industrialized world, is characterized by plowed fields, singular monoculture, singular production of a single food, of whether it's animal or plant, which is segmented and disconnected from other elements in its environment, and it's like treated like essentially a factory. There's an input and an output, and there's an emphasis on fast-growing varieties. Again, whether it's animal or plant, there's increasing amounts of genetic modification in terms of whether it's animal or plant. It's very dependent on chemicals and fossil fuels. It is widely recognized to be inhumane to animals and to humans alike, actually. And the overall approach really diminishes life because it is constantly trying to stomp out quote unquote undesirable insects, undesirable fungi, undesirable plants, and basically just focus on the output of one singular thing in any given field or on any given farm. Overall, I would say that this whole system, although it has been touted for decades as highly efficient, is actually very wasteful. It is polluting and it is extractive. It does not regenerate. It does not sustain over time, which is why I think, fortunately, we're beginning to see a critical mass of people beginning to recognize that the industrial agricultural system cannot continue indefinitely and needs to be reformed. And that's good news. So this is a little picture by the American artist Grandma Moses, who actually didn't start painting until she was 78 years old. And she painted a lot of scenes of sort of traditional American life. And I thought this was a really beautiful depiction of a traditional farm in America. And the thing that I really liked about it is just this hive of activity that's happening and all the people and all the interactions that are happening. And it really shows how farming on traditional farms is about community, and it's about connections, and it's about animals, plants, people all being together in a hive of activity. This is a picture of what traditional hog farming looked like in the United States. Up until just a few decades ago, animals were outdoors. They had a lot of freedom of movement and interaction with each other. And they also had some kind of shelter and protection from the elements, but they were essentially living not too distinctly or too differently than animals had been living for thousands of years who lived alongside humans, and even not too differently from wild animals. But in the last few decades, as we all know, things have changed quite radically. And we now have, as the absolutely standard measure, of course, very industrialized production. So here's a massive monocrop field. Here's the back of an egg laying facility, which has about several 100,000 egg laying hens that are all in cages at this facility. And here's probably the most disturbing photo that I've ever seen about agriculture. This is, these are breeding sows, and this is how they're living on a daily basis. And it's just an absolutely shocking photograph, even to myself, and I've been working in this space for 20 years. So this is one that should make all of us feel very uncomfortable with modern agricultural methods when it comes to animals. Now, on the dietary side are similar industrial kinds of problems. We have plant and animal breeds and varieties that have been developed for decades for rapid growth, for shelf life, and for without regard for flavor or nutrition. And the farming methods that are being used to grow these plants and animals aggravate the lack of flavor and the lack of nutrition. For example, a lot of modern breeds are more water intensive, and therefore the output is more water intensive, water rich, like a vegetable or fruit, for example, often has a much higher water content than it would have had a couple of decades ago. And so this is part of what's happening in terms of diminishing the nutritive value of food. This food is then transported long distances, which further reduces its nutritional quality. It's then stored for long periods of time, further reducing its quality, and then altered in multiple ways, both chemically and physically, to again further diminish its nutritional value. So you get to the point where you start out with something that didn't have a lot of nutrition or flavor in the beginning, and it gets worse and worse as it moves through the industrial food system. As it's altered and turned into processed foods, it very often becomes something with high sugar, the addition of industrial oils, things like soybean oil and palm oil. It becomes a highly caloric food that is very low in nourishment and biologically dead. So I would say, to summarize this sort of standard industrial diet, it is characterized by a lot of processed food, which is unappetizing and non-nourishing. This painting, which is from a Flemish painter about 150 years ago, is a beautiful depiction of what the table in the Western world would have looked like for many people. I mean, this is probably there's more beautiful food here than most people would have had in a typical meal, but it just shows how plants and animals, fish, butter, it's all there. It's colorful, it's appetizing, it's beautiful, and it's very simply prepared. And this is what humans were still eating up until probably about 50 years ago in the developed world. And fortunately, in many parts of the world, there is still a lot of real food being consumed, as their food system is not as yet industrialized, but it is heading in that direction, of course. And unfortunately, this is a very good depiction, I think, of what a lot of people are eating today. And in fact, there was just a few weeks ago, the Journal of the American Medical Association published a new analysis that said for people between the ages of 2 and 19, so basically children in the United States, they were getting almost 3/4 of their calorie daily from this sort of food, from ultra processed foods, which essentially have no nutritional value and have many, many downsides. And what I like about this picture, instead of a lot of other junk food pictures that are out there, is it shows this emphasis on there's a lot of sugar and there's a lot of processed carbohydrates and very, very highly processed food that just simply doesn't our body doesn't recognize and doesn't support our basic bodily functions because it's so altered from what the original foods would have looked like that made these things up. Another point about just this sort of industrial food system that we're all so concerned about, that I've thought about over the years, is that we're basically subsidizing this whole industrial approach almost everywhere in the developed world and in some parts of the developing world. And the I can't say the word, the subsidies, I'll just say it that way, or subsidizing, that's a better word, of these industrialized methods is leading to actually overproduction of a lot of the commodities and a lot of the cheap sort of raw ingredients that create these very highly processed foods, things like sugar and corn and soy. And it is at the same time, because it's increasingly mechanized and less dependent on humans, it is fostering underemployment in the rural community and in the agricultural sector, and resulting in cheap food. So it's cheap in terms of its cost, it's cheap in terms of its nutritional value. And it is contributing to this overall situation that we have today of people overeating, especially in the developed world again, and waste and pollution. And so we just have this, tremendous problem both on the farming side and on the food side. So some people are saying, and this is a flyer from the animal rights activist group, PETA, that we should become vegans. And so the question that my talk is really focusing on is, should we just eliminate animals from the food system in order to address all of these problems? Well, one thing, before I continue on with my presentation, I just want to point out that actually this slide right here kind of answers that question, because almost all of the things pictured in this are actually vegan foods. So that doesn't mean you have to eat like this as a vegan, but it shows very clearly how vegan food is not necessarily healthy food. Taking the animals out of food does nothing inherently to make the food healthier. So to my thinking, this is a very clear illustration of why the vegan idea is not the solution we need. And I just want to point out as well, this increasingly common notion that cattle in particular are, you can equate them with things like industrial machines, and in particular cars. I love just saying cattle are not cars, because they're living elements living in natural environments, and cars are human-made machines with clearly measurable inputs and outputs. I'm going to be talking more about this as I go forward, but this is the first point as to why the vegan idea as a solution to all these problems simply does not really address the core problems. And as the American journalist H.L. Mencken said so well, for every complex problem, there is an answer that is clear, simple, and wrong. And to me, the vegan idea, I'm not saying people shouldn't choose to be vegan if they choose to, but to suggest that that is the solution for the food system or for the health problems related to food, this is what my point is, that does not address the core problems in any way. And it is simply a clear, simple, and wrong solution. So what is the real solution, and what are the real solutions? Well, for one thing, they're complex and they're varied, and there are many. So we have to look at this as a very difficult problem, but one that we can tackle in lots of different ways that are going to be very useful and important when done together. So first of all, we need to think in terms of systems and not just single issues, but what can we do to truly build a food and farming system that is dynamic and resilient? And I think this term that has become very common in the last few years, regenerative farming, is really kind of the core of the whole solution. If regenerative farming is debated in terms of its definition, but to me, the key principles are that it mimics nature, it connects with nature, it focuses on soil biology, and most importantly, the system fosters life. So rather than trying to stomp out every weed or insect or fungi and focus on that as, this undesirable thing doesn't belong in this field, regenerative farming is all about fostering life and fostering truly dynamic ecosystems where food is being created, and making our food systems more like nature, where everything is connected, everything interconnects, and everything regenerates. And when we have that kind of a farming system, we are much closer to solving the dietary problems because you're creating real, whole, nutrient-rich foods. So one of the most interesting and surprising things that I've learned just over the last few years, in particular in my research, is that there are measurable and very demonstrable nutritional benefits to this type of regenerative farming, higher levels of nutrients in various foods, and the presence of all kinds of secondary compounds in the foods that are completely absent from sort of modern industrial foods that so many people are eating today. And when we eat these nutrient-rich, whole, real foods that are from good farming practices that has healthy soil, that food actually fully supports vibrant human health over the long term. So many people in the industrialized world have come to accept this notion that when you reach about age 45 or so, you need to start taking a lot of medications, a lot of supplements, a lot of medicines. You know, you should be taking this pill for this purpose and this pill for this purpose and this, and it's just absolutely standard care now. It's sad to say, but it's the truth in the United States, for example. And rather than viewing, you know, age 45 or 50 as the point at which you need to begin taking a lot of medications, if you are eating well and foods that truly support health, those things are not necessary. And there are examples from all over the world of traditional cultures that are eating non-industrial diets where they don't have any of the long-term diet-related diseases that are so common in the Western world. So I think that we need to move towards focusing on the production and consumption of those whole, real, nutrient-rich foods as the solution to these problems. So even if you buy that argument, everything I just laid out, you might say, okay, but do we really need animals in this system? Because we can do, you know, we can do green manures and we can do more complex dynamic systems without animals. Or I've even heard this said, you can have animals, just not slaughter them for food. Okay, so there are all kinds of ideas out there on this, and I have lots of responses to all of those thoughts. But the bottom line is that yes, we need the animals. And what I'm going to talk about now is why. Why do we need the animals? Okay, first of all, I love this quote from Fritjof Capra, who's a physicist and has written for many years about the whole systems approach to thinking. And he says, in nature, everything is connected. Only humans make linear machines. So I think we just need to immediately, when we begin this whole conversation, think about food systems and farming systems specifically as things that are dynamic, interconnected, complex systems, and that our job as people who care about food and farming is to support the systems that will be the most ecologically sound over the long term and in the short term, and will produce the healthiest food. And of course, there are many other values that need to enter in as well, such as humane treatment of animals and good working conditions for all humans, et cetera, et cetera. But the bottom line is we need to be thinking in this holistic systems way in order to get at those solutions. So just a few examples of the types of systems that are absolutely critical to understand when you're talking about food production and farming is the water cycle as one example. And this is just, I'm not going to go through the details on this, but this is just a graphic that shows how complex the water system is, or the hydrological cycle. And this is a nice graphic of the nutrient cycle, which is a critical component of the regeneration of life. This idea that all life is about birth and growth and death and decay and return, and how all plants and animals are dependent on this cycle. And plants eat other plants, plants eat animals, animals eat plants, everything is all interconnected. And in this picture, they do show a grazing animal, but really there are many, many more animals, both on the microscopic level and of course the insects and the worms and many, many other things, which is better depicted in this next slide, which shows specifically the soil food web, and just shows how there are just countless animals of all different, sort of shapes and sizes that have an impact. And of course, in addition to the animals and the plants being connected, we have the fungi, and the fungi are incredibly important in soil health and beyond that. But I think we're only beginning to understand that as humans, how important the fungi are as well. So it's really about those three components and them working together as ecosystems. And how do we foster that rather than focusing on single inputs and outputs and linear machines that humans make? We can't think of agriculture like that. We really need to think of agriculture in these dynamic systems. And how do we foster systems that are healthy and balanced? So I want to, before I continue on with that, I want to take a moment to pause and address the question of livestock-related greenhouse gas emissions, because there's been so much attention to this issue in recent years that I think it almost puts a full stop on a lot of the conversations about animals and agriculture and their healthful, benefits as food and their healthful benefits in terms of their eco services. And so I just want to quickly address this so that we can move past it, because I know it's something probably everyone who's listening is thinking about as I'm speaking. So let's go through this quickly. So there are lots of different figures out there for the greenhouse gas emissions from livestock around the world. And I think probably the most credible one, although I don't agree with it, and I've written in detail of why I don't agree with it, but I think it's way too high, but I'm going to use it anyways, because we have to have a number for conversation, and this one's probably the most credible one. And that's from the FAO from 2013, where they said that all the livestock globally causes about 14.5% of greenhouse gas emissions. However, in the very same report, the Food and Agriculture Organization acknowledged that there was tremendous mitigation potential that existing and in future to increase from grassland carbon sequestration. And they said, this is the FAO itself talking, that this could significantly offset emissions. So even they acknowledged in making that 14.5% for all livestock globally, they acknowledged that figure was probably quite a bit too high, because they acknowledged that there was a significant offset that could come from, and probably should come from, the carbon sequestration that's fostered by grazing animals. Now, they said they were not going to include that in the calculation because it could not be accurately quantified at this time. This was several years ago. And there's been quite a bit of work since that time to quantify that number. So I think we're much closer to a point now where we can begin to actually figure out how much actual total net greenhouse gas emissions livestock are causing. But the point is that it was acknowledged, even when that figure was created, that there's a significant offset from carbon sequestration related to good farming practices involving livestock. So in the US specifically, I want to sort of further drill down a little bit. All domesticated ruminants are about 2 to 3% of greenhouse gases in the US. So again, when you talk about the developed world, the role of the livestock compared to all of the other emitting things that cause greenhouse gas emissions, especially industrial activities, and in particular transportation, and everything that's related to fossil fuels, is a huge portion, and the livestock is a much smaller portion. And in the US, all domesticated ruminants are about 2 to 3% of greenhouse gases. And that number has been created both by the US Environmental Protection Agency and is also accepted by the United Nations for the United States. And there was a report, a scientific analysis done by scientists in the Proceeding of National Academy of Sciences, so a very prestigious journal, in 2017, that estimated that if you eliminated all farm animals in the United States, you would only get a reduction of about 2.6% of the US greenhouse gases. So these are really critical points to understand at the outset, because it shows that there's a ton of attention to this idea that livestock are incredibly bad for the climate. But when you drill down on the numbers, it's a much smaller issue than fossil fuels and other types of emissions. And it's really just gotten a disproportionate amount of public attention in recent years, which, by the way, has been fostered by this anti-animal agriculture lobby and, sort of activism that's been around anti-animal foods. So it's not scientifically accurate. The amount of attention is not related to the actual impact. And we have to always keep that in mind when we're talking about these things. Now, more specifically, methane. Methane has gotten the most attention, especially recently. And in 2021, there was a large global methane assessment that was done by the UN, which I have read. And essentially, the methane assessment said that there were 3 major sources of methane in the world that should be addressed, and the most important one was fossil fuels. And it also talked about landfills, and a lot of that is food waste, as we all know. And then the third component that it talked about was livestock. And so what I want to address is, what about that part of it? What about the livestock portion of the methane part? So first of all, it's important to note that in North America, it has been calculated that the methane that is currently emitted from the domesticated ruminant animals is actually lower than the methane that was emitted by the wild grazing ruminants that were here before people came from Europe to the New World. And that doesn't change, the fact that these emissions are coming from these animals, but I just think it's an important point of the perspective of putting these issues in perspective, because we're often thinking that these are new emissions that have come out of, that we didn't have before, and this is causing global warming, and that's not correct. Secondly, there's a pretty significant amount of scientific research in the last several years that have really been showing that there's been a misattribution of global increases in methane. And the work of Dr. Robert Haworth at the Cornell University Methane Project, for example, has specifically examined satellite data that was fairly recently said to show methane from cattle. And he has said, no, this is not correct. This is actually methane from fracking. And he's been speaking all around the world, showing how fracking is causing, this is part of fossil fuel extraction methods. And he's saying this is actually causing a lot of the methane that is the newer methane that's increasing globally, although interestingly in the US, total methane numbers have been going down for quite some time. There's also, just in the last several months, there's been revelation of a pretty significant amount of underreporting of methane from all of the fossil fuel sectors, natural gas, coal, and oil. The Washington Post, for example, did a huge expose about some of the methane leaks in Russia that were not only unreported, but in fact, they denied them. But the satellite data very clearly shows that it's coming from them. And throughout the United States and Europe and other parts of the world, there are thousands of methane leaks that have not been reported, are not being regulated, and were not being counted in the totals that are due to fossil fuel production. So all of this means that the share of global methane that had previously been attributed to cattle is seriously in doubt now, because the methane numbers, even those that were being used in the global assessment, the 2021 global assessment, are basically wrong because they did not get accurate numbers for fossil fuel emissions of methane. And sort of following on that theme of misaccounting, I just want to point out the work of Dr. Miles Allen, who I heard speak in person in 2019 at the Sustainable Food Trust event, actually, in England. And he has been writing and speaking all over the world about the fact that the conventional methods for accounting for methane are just wrong, and they're not scientifically accurate. And recently, my understanding is the IPCC has acknowledged that what he's saying is correct. And so hopefully that will begin to shift some of the discussion around methane. When you're talking specifically about the methane from cattle, it's really important, and from other livestock, it's really important to always keep in mind as well that this is in striking contrast to fossil fuel methane. This is not new carbon. This is old carbon that was part of the biogenic methane cycle, where things are going through plants and animals and going into the atmosphere and coming back through photosynthesis back into plants and then being consumed by animals and so forth. And so there's this should be considered in a very different way than carbon that is coming from deeply buried fossil fuels, coal, natural gas, et cetera, and then is being released, which is new carbon, into the atmosphere through fossil fuel production. And finally, I want to just point out another person that I met through Sustainable Food Trust, Dr. Michael Lee, who's a professor of sustainable livestock systems at Bristol University. He has done a very interesting analysis about the greenhouse gas emission impacts of foods, and showing that basically all of the current analyses on this subject are taking food simply by kilogram and saying this amount of kilogram and comparing them, and this is how much greenhouse gas it causes. And it's kind of a really absurd method. And he has recalculated it using nutrient value and nutritional quality. And he's shown that in particular, grass-fed beef does very, very well on that kind of, with that kind of approach, because the nutritional value of grass-fed beef is so high that it doesn't, when you consider it in that way, it has a much lower greenhouse gas impact. Now, continuing a little further on methane, because this is so important, because there's so much conversation about it. Another point about methane is the methanotropes. Methanotropes, sorry, my tongue's a little tight today, and the methane oxidizing bacteria, same thing, different name. Basically, some of the research on this arena comes from the field of termite research, because termites are like tiny little cattle. And it was always thought that basically they take the same way cattle do, they take cellulosic material and they use through a very complex relationship with millions of different types of microorganisms that live in their guts. They take cellulosic material. In the case of termites, it's basically wood. In the case of cattle, it's basically forage, grass, etc. But they take it and they consume it, and then with these microorganisms, they turn it into nourishment for themselves. And historically, the termite mounds were considered a major source of methane globally. And then there was a bunch of research a couple of decades ago, and that continues to today, showing that actually the total output of methane from termite mounds is much less, and in some research shows it's zero, because these mounds are so heavily occupied with methane oxidizing bacteria. So all the methane that is released from the termites is immediately consumed, because nature is that way. It works that way. It has, whenever there's something being created or output, there's something else that evolves to consume it. And that's how termite mounds came from being something that was viewed as a very high methane emitter to something that's being viewed as methane neutral or much lower in methane. And the research that has followed on that research is looking at cattle and how much methane oxidizing bacteria are existing in the soils where cattle exist. And there's been research done on this by Dr. Mark Adams at Sydney University, Australia, and there's been research done on this by Dr. Ed Bork at University of Alberta in Canada, and there are probably people elsewhere in the world looking at this as well, but those are the studies I'm aware of. And basically, their research has been showing that wherever you have, especially a well-managed cattle grazing system, a pretty significant share of that methane that is emitted from the cattle is actually immediately consumed by the methane oxidizing bacteria. And so that's one other component that has not been fully added into the calculations, that in fact hasn't been considered at all when the methane numbers are created for cattle and other livestock. Also, there's really good work around the world being done on mitigation. So the rice industry was, in the 1980s, it was considered the largest human-caused source of methane, actually, and there was as much as 30% of human-caused methane was attributed to the rice industry, but they've made some pretty significant changes that have led to pretty dramatic reductions. Actually, I had a conversation a couple years ago with a scientist who didn't agree with this. So it may not be universally accepted, but most people that I've read and have talked with about this agree that the rice industry has made pretty dramatic reductions in their methane production through changing practices. And the same thing is being done in the cattle field. There are agricultural universities and researchers around the world that are experimenting with and exploring lots of different ways of reducing the methane that comes from cattle. Seaweed is probably the most promising line of research. Up to 99% of the methane has been shown to be able to be reduced or eliminated when some seaweed is added to the feed. Then you get into a whole problem of creating, enough seaweed. So I'm not sure any one of these things are the solution. Again, I don't favor silver bullets, but I think these are important ideas. It's also been shown by research around the world that dung beetle populations are important in terms of methane emissions, and the more dung beetles you have, the lower your methane emissions. And even things like rumen weights, little metal weights that are placed in the rumen of cattle, has been shown to pretty dramatically reduce methane from cattle for reasons that are not fully understood. There's also very good work around the world that's being done on sort of this focus of farming for soil carbon. And even the global methane assessment talked about the farmers of Uruguay and how just by working with farmers in Uruguay, they were able to dramatically reduce methane emissions and increase carbon sequestration in the soils by taking certain steps to make the grazing more ecological. And of course, we all know that France has undertaken this 4 per 1,000 initiative to get more carbon into the soils. And California is another place, my home state now, where there's been an incentivizing of getting farmers more focused on this question of how do we get the grazing and other practices to get more carbon into the soil. And these are all things that are being done right now. And I think Patrick might want to say something. Is that true, Patrick? Did you want to say? Okay, I'll keep going then. So the bottom line on the methane and this whole global warming and global greenhouse gases from livestock is it's really not an intractable problem. There are many solutions. There are many approaches. There's a lot of work being done on it. It's an important issue, but it is not one that should say or convince any of us that we should get rid of cattle or other animals in the food system. And as I'm going to describe now, the animals are incredibly important for other reasons. So let's look at some of those now. First, here's a list of advantages of animals versus crops. And this is true, particularly true in certain parts of the world, but all of these are somewhat true in every place. For one thing, if you have grazing animals, you don't need to own any land to graze those animals. And I've talked with, I spoke at a livestock keepers conference in Germany a few years ago that had grazing people from around the world. And I learned in those conversations that most of the people that were at this conference and that were represented by people at this conference are actually people who have herds and flocks, and they own no land whatsoever. And they take these animals out to various parts of the region that they live in every day, or they're even nomadic and they move throughout the countries that they live in with their flocks and herds. And they don't need to have any land ownership. That is something you cannot do with crop farming. Because these crops and these flocks and herds actually go into spaces that are available for public grazing, they can have a living and they can produce good, healthy food and a livelihood for themselves and their family without even having the capacity to own land. And likewise, the animals are portable. So whenever there's a need to move, whether it's to do with political conditions or weather conditions or whatever, there are many reasons people move around. You can actually bring your livestock with you. That is obviously not the case with crop production. And unlike crop production, you have a flexible harvest. So you can keep your animals until the time at which you need to either have the food or have the revenue from the animals. You can sell them or you can slaughter them at the moment that you need that revenue or that food. And obviously a crop has to be put in the ground, it has to be growing, and it has to ripen and then be harvested. And that's all very set in stone, basically, when that can happen. Totally different with livestock. So that's a very unique benefit. And similarly, because of that, the livestock is like a savings account for people around the world, because you can use it in a flexible way and you can access it or not, depending on your needs. Now, when I was writing the book, Defending Beef, I found an incredible wealth of information about the health benefits of humans living alongside livestock. And I describe this in quite a bit of detail in my book. But there's research from all over the world showing that humans, actually, in fact, they even have looked specifically at women when they're pregnant and they work with livestock, and shown that even in that situation even helps to have healthier babies, because the fetus has already had access to the immune benefits that you get from being around livestock. And then whole populations benefit from having livestock in the population in terms of population immunity. And then just because you have livestock in a place means that you're able to live in rural areas that would otherwise not be populatable, because you can't grow crops in those regions. And in fact, people think about this a lot with the developing world, but I have been to many parts of the United States in the Western, especially the arid far West, where I know ranchers that live on huge tracts of land that are completely non-farmable, and because they're so arid and cold and dusty and dry, and the cattle do quite well in these environments, and these families are able to live in these rural areas because of the existence of their cattle herds. There's no other way they could populate these areas. And I think this is important because, as I argue in Defending Beef, I think people being able to live out in the rural areas has huge benefits for a country and for the population in many different ways, which I describe in my book. And then finally, it's just producing food from non-farmable land. So as much as 70% of the crop or the agricultural land in the world is said to have livestock on it, and the vast majority of that land is land where you could not grow crops. So we would be taking away lands that are contributing to our food production worldwide if we no longer use those lands. And I think that's an incredibly important point, and it's very misunderstood because people are often talking about how much land it uses to raise livestock, and they're talking about that being wasteful. Well, it's not wasteful if you cannot use it to produce non-animal food. Okay, in fact, you're adding to the food system. Okay, and then this is a great quote that I love from the Sustainable Food Trust, which has cited this calculation that was based on research, various different forms of research, that says that between 9 to 23 grams of protein per person per day for global population, around 20 to 50% of the world's total requirements could be provided by livestock reared on human inedible feeds, with the most important of these being grass, as well as 10% of our energy and iron needs, 20% of our calcium and zinc needs, and a massive 75% of our vitamin B12 needs. And then the Sustainable Food Trust points out this is a crucial food source if we are to feed a growing population. So again, if you take away livestock, you actually dramatically reduce not just food, but food that is incredibly valuable for the health and nourishment of people around the world. And because so much of it is done with farm byproducts and grass, and everything from rice stalks, and sometimes it's also used for bedding. It's used in a lot of different ways for livestock. Animals are incredibly important recyclers of farm wastes, and they're also incredibly important converters of inedible vegetation that is all around the world, and that would not be producing food if we did not have these grazing animals. So overall, there's this tremendous ecosystem benefit from having animals in our food system. Probably the most important thing is that they enhance soil health. And there's more and more focus on soil biology. I spoke with someone recently who had been in agriculture for decades, and he said, I always learned about soil chemical properties and physical properties, but I never was taught about soil biology until recent years. So this is a really important shift in focus. And the North Dakota farmer, Gabe Brown, who many of you probably have heard of or maybe even met, because he's probably one of the most famous farmers in the world right now. He's written a tremendous book called Dirt to Soil that I absolutely love. And in this book, and also when I've spoken with him personally, he has told me that the more livestock that he has added to his farm, the healthier his soil became. And he was working with USDA soil scientist Christine Nichols for many years to actually measure the carbon contents of his soil. So he can actually say that with certainty. And in his book, Dirt to Soil, he actually has some charts where he shows how when he added more livestock, he got more carbon in his soil. And not just that, but I love Gabe Brown's explanation when he says, when he was a conventional farmer, I went from thinking every morning, what am I gonna kill today? What plant, what, weed, what fungus am I gonna kill today? What insect am I gonna go out there and kill today? And then as he shifted and transitioned gradually to this totally regenerative focus that he now is, a leading proponent of in the world, he says he now focuses on fostering life. And that's what he has on his farm. It is full of life and interconnectedness and diversity. So it mirrors nature. He's a wonderful example of that. Livestock around the world create and maintain grasslands that were once created and that our earth evolved with wild grazing animals that we no longer have. So they play that incredibly important role in sort of maintaining not just these open grasslands for us to enjoy and look at, but for all of the species that exist in those grasslands. And there's this beautiful pastoral landscape wherever you have the grazing livestock that I think is not something we talk about very often, but it is incredibly important as a value for humanity. And wherever you have well-managed grazing, and this is a key point, it has to be well-managed, you have the protection of soil and water because you have this dense vegetative cover, and there's very good research from a lot of different universities showing that where you have good grazing, you have a lot more vegetative growth and you have more diversity of vegetation, and that therefore you get more soil and more life in the soil and more water in the soil. And so animals actually add not just to the soil, but they safeguard water, and they keep water in an ecosystem by virtue of being there. So these are incredibly important values. And unlike crop production, the vast majority of the world's crop production is done with plowing. You can raise grazing animals, especially, without doing any plowing at all. And they can simply be grazing on naturally occurring vegetation and rainwater. That's what we do on our own ranch, for example, in California. We only use naturally occurring vegetation that is rain fed with water and powered by the sun. And that's all we're doing. We're just harvesting that. And what that's doing then is creating a protective blanket over the earth, which protects the soils and the water, and it fosters the subterranean environment underneath. That's the next point. And this creation of these open areas and all kinds of different wild areas where cattle and other animals can graze and inhabit, and the livestock of the world's farms and ranches has been increasingly recognized to actually benefit biodiversity. And not only does it create wildlife habitat for birds and bees, for example, and the Audubon Society is one of the many organizations that has now acknowledged that what's good for the herd is good for the bird. And they're working very closely with hundreds of farmers in the United States, farmers and ranchers in the United States. But there's also just a benefit to the whole system because of the fact that you have this healthier and more biologically diverse and more moist soil at the foundation. So it leads to a great deal more benefit to the biodiversity and to the wildlife in the system. And this is just an article that I wrote a few years ago about the fact that cattle grazing has been shown now to be a tremendously important way to support America's declining bee population, and something that's even more important because of this colony collapse disorder that we've seen around the developed world. And this is just a quick picture to sort of illustrate some of what's going on beneath the soil and how grass has this very tangled and very densely fibrous set of roots that hold the soil, hold the moistures, create little pathways for the water to go, and create enormous surface areas for the exchanges between the soil and the plant. And all of this being fostered by the glomalin, which is a substance that was identified by USDA soil scientists a few years ago, which is mediating these transactions between the plants and the soils, where the plant is getting the nutrients that it needs from the soils, and the plant is giving the soil the carbon. And these exchanges are being fostered by glomalin. And this picture shows what that is, something that wasn't even known about until a couple of decades ago. And here's an overall sort of ecosystem picture that's from my friend Seth Itzkan, who's an ecological consultant from Karoo, South Africa. And it shows uh, two different plots of land that are right next to each other, and shows how where you have a holistically managed grazing system, you're actually bringing carbon and water into the grassland. You're restoring that land and protecting it and creating more carbon and moisture in the soil, as I was just talking about. And right next to it, you have a desertifying piece of land that is degrading and losing moisture and losing carbon. Now, in this case, there were cattle and other grazing animals on both sides of the fence, but it was all about the way they were managed. So this is showing very graphically that it's not the cow, it's the how. And I want to show a few more slides, but that is the key message that I hope all of you will take away from this talk. Now, looking at the dietary side, the key, in my view, to dealing with the dietary problems and health-related problems we have in so many parts of the world related to food is a return to real foods. And we need to not just focus on what's on our plate, but again, what are we doing on farm to create or not create this kind of food? And what kind of food system are we creating to make it possible for us, financially viable and accessible, to have these foods? And real foods are characterized by foods with a lot of flavor. And it's interesting how little attention that gets nowadays. When we talk about food, we talk a lot about, calories. We talk a lot about greenhouse gases, but we don't talk about flavor very often. And in fact, this is one of the key distinctions between real food and industrial food. Real food actually has vibrant flavor. And as I was talking about earlier, modern industrial breeds of animals and plants have much less flavor, and that correlates with lower levels of nutrition. So we need to think about what can we do in our farming to foster greater flavor in the foods that we're producing, and what kinds of varieties and breeds should we be having to produce higher levels of flavor. And similarly, a lot of that flavor corresponds with not just the nutrients that we're familiar with, but also very important secondary compounds, things like tannins. And these are things that we sometimes think of negative because they are things that the plant uses to fight off, insects and other kinds of pests that it has. But it turns out that they may be incredibly important for human health and for keeping us healthy. And those secondary compounds are present in real foods, especially wild foods and forage foods and things, older varieties of plants and animals. And they're pretty much absent from modern industrial food, and especially the more processed that it gets, the less, to the point where you have none at all. And these may be the single most important thing in food today that always has been, in fact. And this could explain this tremendous rise in diet-related diseases that we see in the industrialized world. These flavor compounds and secondary compounds are things that will naturally delight the senses. This is things that attract us to food. These are things that make us enjoy food. And it signals to our physiology that these are things that are containing nutrition, which taps into our inherent nutritional wisdom, which every wild animal has, every domesticated animal has, and every human has. But we've gotten increasingly disconnected from this whole system that we have for keeping ourselves healthy. In fact, we now generally believe that we need experts to tell us what to eat, which is sort of a bizarre concept if you think about it, because every animal in the wild knows what to eat. And we now consider ourselves like the most intelligent of all of the animal species on the planet, but we need experts to tell us what to eat. It's kind of bizarre if you think about it for a moment. So the point is, if you're eating real foods, you don't need an expert to tell you what to eat. Especially if you've been reared with it, and if your mother was eating real food, and if you were breastfed when she was eating real food, and then you were being given real food around a table with your family, you are going to develop that inherent nutritional wisdom. And even if you those things didn't happen, it's something you can cultivate. And real foods satiate and fully nourish us. So not only do they keep us healthy, but we avoid obesity and the metabolic diseases associated with modern industrial food. And the two books that I think I would recommend the highest, I mean, I hope you all will consider buying, my books, but if you want other book recommendations, these are probably my two favorite books that I've read in recent years, and I read a lot. They're both Nourishment by Dr. Fred Provenza, who's an animal nutrition expert, and The Dorito Effect, which talks about his work, about Fred Provenza's work, but also a lot more. And these two books together make this whole argument that I was just talking about, that flavor and secondary compounds contained in plants and also in animals that are raised on grass and have access to real vegetation, that those things are the things that signal to us what we need to eat and what we need to consume in order to stay healthy and to not just ward off illness, but even to treat any kinds of illnesses. Not to say, now I should clarify, I'm not opposed to modern medicine, and I actually have two sisters that are both MDs, but I think this is an incredibly important argument that they've made here, that we have a fundamental nutritional wisdom that we are almost entirely failing to use right now. And I think that is a key part of getting back to healthy humans and healthy food systems. Now, a little more about why I believe so strongly that animals are an important part of the food system. And this is again on the food side of the question. So as I mentioned, I was a biology major, and as I was preparing this talk and I made this slide, I thought, boy, some people are going to get upset when they see this title that I put on this, but it's just an absolute statement of fact. Humans evolved to be omnivores. Now, it doesn't mean that you can't choose not to follow an omnivorous diet, but it is undeniable that we evolved to be omnivores. And that doesn't just mean that we were consuming animal-based foods for 3 million years, which is true, but it also means that our entire physiology is built with the expectation that it's going to get these animal-based foods. And so things are, your whole body and all your systems in your body are expecting those high quality nutrients that come from animal-based foods. And there will inevitably be challenges to anybody that is lacking those. And Dr. Georgia Ede, who's a psychiatrist, an MD, but who focuses specifically on this question of diet and its relationship to human health, has written some really, really great articles and done a lot of research on this topic. And her overall statement on this is that, unfortunately, plant nutrients often suffer from low bioavailability, which means they are hard for us to extract, absorb, and utilize, which is why she's a very strong advocate for the inclusion of animal-based foods in the diet. And a few examples that she gives, people often talk about iron and protein, but I want to talk about a couple of other things because these are really good examples that most people don't know about why animal-based foods are so important for human health. She talks about vitamin A, for example, and she says plants contain carotenoids, which we must then convert into retinol, the form of vitamin A our bodies can use. This is 12 to 24 times more difficult than obtaining retinol from animal foods. And so you're basically challenging your body tremendously by excluding animal-based foods. And whereas if you are consuming animal-based foods, and you have enough access to them, you will be easily able to meet this nutritional need. Similarly, iron, I talk about this in quite a bit of depth in Defending Beef, is much more usable when it comes from an animal-based source than from a plant. And her research, Dr. Ede, shows that vegetarians and vegans, kind of in many different studies, have been shown to have lower iron stores. Now, she notes that a lot of vegetarians and vegans eat a lot of iron-rich foods, but she explains, and I urge anyone who's interested in this topic to look at her writings, because she explains why your body has a hard time absorbing those a lot of times. And as she says, you could eat a whole bowl of spinach and get almost no iron from that because it's so hard for your body to absorb it based on other compounds that are in spinach that inhibit the absorption. And another point, I think a lot of people know about the iron issue, but I think fewer people know about the zinc issue. And she talks about zinc as being another really important nutrient that is very hard to get if you don't have any animal-based foods in your diet. And she cites a 2017 Swiss study that found that 47% of vegans had inadequate zinc compared to only 10% of omnivores. Our bodies cannot store zinc. The plant foods richest in zinc also happen to contain compounds which interfere with zinc absorption. So as with iron, zinc is difficult to get enough of in your body if you're not eating any animal-based foods. And perhaps most importantly, it's DHA and EPA. These are essential omega-3 fatty acids that are very important for our human health, and particularly for your brain function and immune system function. And there is absolutely none of it at all in vegan foods, and just a little bit in a vegetarian diet. So people that are following a vegetarian or vegan diet are really strongly urged to supplement those. But I would argue that a healthy diet is one that contains everything that your body needs to be healthy over the long term. So that to me is a very strong argument for keeping animal-based foods in the food system. Now, as I was compiling, as I was preparing for this presentation, I was sort of compiling a list of all the people that I've done a lot of reading from and that have talked a lot about the importance of animal-based foods in the human diet. And I suddenly realized they were all women. There are some men, of course, that are doing this kind of work as well, but I just wanted to highlight some of the wonderful work that's being done by some of the wonderful women that I just created this title, Women for Full Nutrition. So this idea that you should be able to get all of the nutrients you need from your diet rather than relying on supplements, and that should be considered a healthy diet. Diana Rogers, Nina Teichholz, Catherine Shanahan, Joanne Blythman, Zoe Harcum, Adele Height, Nina Plank, and then I added mothers and grandmothers around the world, because I think this is something that increasingly the people that are feeding their families are really increasingly aware that the modern diet is woefully lacking in deep nutrition, and that we need to focus on that and make sure that we're all getting that, especially to our children, because it's so important in their development. Now, all of the things I've talked about today are covered in my book, Defending Beef. And so if you want additional, all of them have a lot of scientific, I'm both a scientist and a lawyer, so I really care about good citations, and they're all cited with academic research in my book, Defending Beef. So if anyone wants to, of course, we're gonna have question and answer in a moment here, but I also encourage you to take a look at my book. And I just want to end on a few beautiful photographs that I think are the food system that I believe that we can have, which is about integrated systems that have that are human scale and animal scale, and they're not about machines, they're not about chemicals, they're not about industrialization. They're about real people being connected with their land, being connected with their animals. And this is one of my favorite farmers, Paul Willis in Iowa, with one of his sows. And he's just a wonderful inspiration, and was the co-founder of the Niman Ranch Network, along with my husband, Bill Niman. And this is also a picture from a Niman Ranch farm as well in Iowa. And this as well, this is a sow building a nest. A lot of people don't know that sows do that, because in modern systems, they're not allowed to. But if you give a sow the opportunity, she will build a nest before she has her piglets. And then this is a picture from upstate New York, a grass-based chicken operation. And this is this is a picture from our own ranch. That's my husband, Bill Niman. And this is during the dry season, when we do supplement what our cattle eat with hay. And that's the only thing they ever eat, is naturally occurring forage and a small amount of hay during the dry season. And then this is a picture of myself out on the ranch with one of our calves. And these are we also raise heritage turkeys who are grass fed. And you can see one of our livestock guarding dogs in the background there. And finally, to end, I just want to restate again that to me, this is all about this one simple concept. It is not the cow, it's the how. We need to focus on real solutions that produce not only healthy environments, but nutrient-rich, delicious, health-supporting foods. And when we do that, we will actually begin building a food system that will create healthy humans and a healthy planet. So it is not the cow, it is the how. Thank you. And I look forward to your questions.
Well, what a tour de force. Fantastic. So thank you so much, Nicolette. I've got a bit of feedback here. So
Yeah, do you have two devices on, Patrick?
Yeah, only because I needed to get the questions out. Let me think how I can deal with that. Well, I'll just share a few reflections, one of which is a question about the questions, which I now cannot see irritatingly, but I hopefully can get them down in a moment. What strikes me is that if there were or are people who are opposed to the arguments that Nicolette has been making during this presentation, they haven't been prominently featuring in the questions or even in the chat. And I was just wondering whether there is a questioner out there who is still in any doubt about the role of livestock in sustainable food systems. And I want to also relate that to my first question, which is brought up by Jimmy Woodrow, which is related to that. Are we getting through? Because you could say, somebody said in the questions, this is an echo chamber and we're all violently agreeing with each other. And from my impressions of both the chat and also the questions, there is a lot of agreement. There also is a brilliantly sophisticated understanding, which has developed during the last hour about how livestock can play a central role in sustainable food systems. But are we actually getting through? Because in the end, that's what matters. Because certainly I can say this, Nicolette, that our climate change committee don't fully understand the arguments we've been making. I wouldn't say that our government fully understands the arguments you've been making. In fact, I would say still in the heart of the scientific community, there is still a huge amount of skepticism. And I'd also like to ask you this. Somebody else put this in the question as well. There is not an adequate differentiation between the livestock which are part of the problem and those which are part of the solution. So would you like to start by just addressing those points? Jimmy's point, are we breaking through? Have you seen any evidence of that, et cetera, et cetera?
Okay, well, I apologize for having to move. I had almost lost power there, but I've connected to power now. I mean, yes, I'm always surprised how even among very well-informed people and very thoughtful people, even who might acknowledge, well, there is some place for animals in these systems. There's still this underlying assumption that we need to dramatically reduce our consumption of animal-based foods, especially in the Western world and the developed world, and that we need to dramatically reduce the numbers of animals on the landscape. And having gone through the process of being an environmental lawyer that was working on this, and who had absolutely had that same perspective when I began this work 20 years ago, and especially as a vegetarian, when I was, I probably for the first 10 years of work on this, I thought, well, we all know we need to reduce the amount of animal foods we're eating. And, my work was just kind of reinforcing that idea. But that's an idea that I've come quite a long ways from now, because increasingly I've seen evidence, both anecdotal and in terms of research, that where you have well-managed livestock, it's almost like the more the better. And I don't want to sound, too, over the top here, but there really is no convincing evidence that, for example, meat is bad for your health. And in fact, as I was, sort of articulating in this talk, there's a tremendous amount of evidence now that the rise in diet-related diseases we're seeing in so many parts of the world are actually specifically related to a migration away from foods like meat and butter and cheese. And so I actually don't think it's necessarily an echo chamber, because in fact, I was just reading an interview this morning from a person who is very involved in sustainable food advocacy. And she said, well, I've always assumed that we just need to dramatically reduce how many animals we have. And I know, well-managed animals can be okay. My position is quite different from that. I really believe that animals are an absolute net positive for the environment and for our health when they are well raised. So that's an important distinction, number one. And number two, with respect to the importance of distinguishing, yes, I mean, my whole job for the 2 years that I worked at Waterkeeper Alliance, and my whole first book, which is called Righteous Pork Chop, is about the industrialization of animal-based foods and the problems with raising animals in industrial ways. Extreme problems for the animals and environmental problems, and even problems for the humans that are working in those kinds of systems. So I agree strenuously and wholeheartedly with the idea that it's important to make a distinction between the different ways that we're raising animals. But that being said, I also believe that there's the foods from animals are valuable to humans in their diets. And so I am increasingly less interested in sort of criticizing people for choosing foods that are from cheaper systems, because just because I can afford to buy better meat, I don't want to tell someone else, well, you shouldn't eat meat because, you don't have enough money in your food budget or whatever. So I think these are important conversations. And I think it's always really important to emphasize the need to improve the way animals are raised. And I've done a lot of that kind of work for the last 20 years. But I also do not want to say, I do not agree at all that we should be telling people not to eat meat unless they can buy it from the best possible source.
Well, that's very interesting, and I probably got into a bit of trouble here by taking a slightly different approach from you, because it seems to me that unless we establish in the public mind the differentiation between the systems of livestock production which are absolutely part of the problem and those which are part of the solution, and shop accordingly, you just leave the whole of the farming community in complete confusion. So I do think we need some pretty clear guidance. Do you not think that? And also, I saw a question in the chat just now, how much livestock products would be available were they all to be produced in regenerative ways? And this is a key issue, it seems to. What do you think about those 2 points?
Yeah, well, on the second point, it's an issue that I've looked at quite a bit in my research and I've written about several times. And actually, I do not believe there's any compelling evidence to suggest that we couldn't produce enough or even produce all of what is currently produced if we converted to better methods. And part of the reason that is, for example, with grazing systems in the United States, for example, some people have claimed that if you took away, the feedlots and you just put all the cattle back on grass, well, you couldn't produce nearly enough beef or nearly as much as you do now. And actually, that's not true at all, because there's very good research showing that the sort of the productivity of the land, the productivity of the grasses, and how much meat and milk you could produce would rise dramatically with better grazing practices. And so the Savory Institute, for example, has done an analysis that says that you would have not just enough land if you converted to better grazing practices and put all the animals on grass, but you would have a 30% excess in land available in North America to do that if you made that kind of a conversion. So there's good work. I've cited it in my first book, especially in Righteous Pork Chop. I kind of go through some detail showing that there have been attempts to quantify how much you could raise if you went to all organic or all sustainable, et cetera, taking all the animals out of cages and buildings. It's absolutely doable. And I think more and more of the evidence is showing that these systems are so much more productive over the long term, that it's not just that we could do it, but I think we must do it. There's kind of an ecological imperative in terms of being able to feed humanity over the longer term. And then on the other point you raised, Patrick, about urging people to buy from the best possible sources and seek out regenerative, I agree 100% with that, because I actually think that is the key solution for making it economically viable for people that are in agriculture to begin trying to improve their practices and try to pursue this path of truly regenerative food production. And they will never be able to do that without the support of informed consumers. So I think that's a very, very important message. But what I would never say to someone is, do not buy any meat if you can't buy from these regenerative sources. What I would instead say is, seek out the best possible source that you can, and do that every time you shop.
Okay, so just back to Jimmy's question, are you getting through in the US? Do you feel that there's a breakthrough happening? Because your point about echo chamber is well made, but nevertheless, this is a very small number of people. I hope it'll get out very widely. And if people read your book, Defending Beef, they will get the messages and spread them further. But how much are these kind of brilliantly presented ideas that you shared with us today getting out there in conventional circles in the US?
Well, I'm actually quite optimistic about that. I mean, obviously all of us working in this space, sometimes it's easy to feel discouraged, but honestly, when I began this work in 2000, so 22 years ago almost, yes, as of now, um, I would talk to people about the work I was doing, and people would just look at me with blank stares. There wasn't even a real understanding that there is a problem in mainstream agriculture at that time. And striking contrast, today with that is that I constantly am talking to people in just any venue that I'm in, whether it's like at a school board meeting or whatever. I'm talking with people who are very interested in seeking well-raised foods for themselves and for their families. So there's just this whole dramatically different awareness about the fact that there are differences in the way foods are raised, and that has health implications for you, and nutritional implications, and ecological implications. And then this whole question of the animals and the importance of taking good care of the animals in the food system. I think that was something, again, that very few people were talking about and thinking about a couple decades ago. And now it is a very common topic of conversation. So I think that's an important step. Whenever a public issue shifts over time, you have phases. And I think we're in the sort of awareness phase. And the danger in the awareness phase is, people recognize there's a problem, and then they say, oh, we need, the silver bullet solution that H.L. Mencken pointed out is never going to work. So now it's our job as advocates and people who are aware and concerned, and we're in this echo chamber, apparently. I didn't realize it was an echo chamber till you said that. I thought there was more of a diversity of views here, but anyways.
Well, I've been surprised, to be honest, at how little you've been challenged in the chat or the questions, but there are one or two that are, I think the questions have been incredibly sophisticated, but yeah, it's as if everybody's basically buying into your premise and wanting to get into the detail rather than fundamentally challenging it, which is why I asked the wider question.
And for me, so the point is that, I'm optimistic because I think there's this dramatic rise in awareness that has happened. And now it's our job, all of us collectively that are on this call today, to go out into the world and make that case. We shouldn't be capitulating to this argument just because it's become mainstream. This idea that animals should be eliminated from our diets, from the food system. We need to make the case that our job is to build vibrant, truly, nature reflecting food systems, and those require animals. And so that, to me, is the challenge, and resist the call for the silver bullet solutions.
Rather good question here, an ethical question, which troubles me too, from David Finney. He says, can we really defend, he buys into the regenerative animal farming systems delivering all those good outcomes, but can we defend the ethics of killing, not for me raising and eating, but the killing bit? He says, my daughter, vegan, asked me this question, and it does bother me. What bothers me about the animals that we're rearing is I feel their deaths aren't too good. And that's partly because of the concentration of abattoirs. You know all about that. What would you say about the ethics of the slaughter and how we can deal with that, how we can address that?
Well, I think the question actually has two different implications. One is it ethical at all, since they're being killed to eat? And I mean, I would have to say, obviously, that's an individual choice that every person has to make. But for me, I view humans as an animal that are part of a natural world. And as I mentioned in the talk, I just view, and especially having lived on a ranch for the last 18 years and being out in the natural environment and in the natural world a large portion of every day, it's just really reinforced to me that this is the natural system that we all are part of. And to me, it's almost a bizarre separation of the human from that natural system if we say, well, I'm not going to engage in killing. And of course, there's also a whole fantasy, if you're not eating animals, that you're not killing. And there's been a lot written and a lot of research on that, showing all of the killing that happens in the production of non-animal based foods. So I think, and it's just because it's out of sight and out of mind doesn't mean it's not happening. It's still real. So there's that. But then with respect to the slaughter question, I have to say, I think think my husband, Bill Niman, has been a real leader in this. He has been insisting for decades that the slaughter be done incredibly carefully. And every animal that he's ever slaughtered for meat, and for all the companies he's been involved with, is only done in a way that he approves. And we've written about this in our own, we have a cookbook called the Niman Ranch Cookbook that we wrote, and we've written about it in other places. And I've written an op-ed for the New York Times called Support Your Local Slaughterhouses, where I talk more about the ethics of slaughterhouses. But I think there's improvement to be made, but it's absolutely possible to kill an animal without fear or pain. And actually, I hosted a conference in Iowa about 20 years ago, where we had an expert from Sweden that showed some videotapes of well-done slaughter, and it was really impressive, the difference in the way the animals entered and their whole experience. And they were completely quiet and completely calm because it was a well-designed slaughterhouse. So I think Temple Grandin and other people have really brought this issue up and shown the importance of humane practices at slaughter. And I think the industry has come a long way, and there's more work to be done.
A couple of questions from Paul Susek. The meat, I'm not sure if I think you've dealt with this, but he's still worried that you haven't properly addressed the question of how much land would be needed for animal grazing. And then, I guess related to that, the question of methane. Well, I think you've dealt with both of those questions, but he's bringing them up still. So do you want to say anything about those?
Okay, well, just quickly, I think the methane issue is important, but has been dramatically misunderstood and miscast. And there's a lot of information that has proven to be very wrong in that. So I think the methane issue is being reevaluated. And in my book, Defending Beef, I go through a lot of detail on that. And I just would encourage, anyone to look at that who wants to know more about that. And with respect to the amount of land, so to reemphasize this point, when animals are well managed, the land is far more productive. And so any analysis that shows that there is inadequate land is probably failing to take that into consideration. You get more food, you get more vegetation, you get more biological productivity of all types when you have well-managed agricultural practices. And that's why it's about the how, not the cow.
What would you say? I would think there are thousands of arable farmers, and mainly arable farmers, and people who are fairly committed to plant-only production at the moment, maybe listening to this, hopefully listening to this, but certainly what they're asking this question, since there's been this huge trend towards plant-based diets, which seems to have got through to a lot of people, how can I risk converting to a mixed farming system? And I imagine there are a lot of farmers in the Midwest asking the same sort of question, because they need capital investment, that it's a big risk, it's a big change, there are new skills involved, when the trends seem to be away from eating livestock products. Do you see that in America, those questions of the arable farmers in the Midwest, the tillage farmers out there as well? Certainly it's a question we're being asked here.
No, I mean, I think, as someone who's a vegetarian for 33 years myself, I'm certainly aware of vegetarian and vegan diets and, and their popularity and so forth. What's actually, first of all, 90% of people, there's a lot of research showing 89 to 90% of people that become vegan for a period of time revert to eating omnivorously. So there's a kind of an experimental phase. We've seen a lot of attention by celebrities and others saying, oh, you should be vegan. And a lot of the people that were saying that publicly have actually now gone back to omnivorous diets. And there are more and more testimonies and books being written and articles being written about people that had long-term health effects or very acute health problems because they became vegan for a period of time. And so I think what happens is there's an idea and it bubbles up for a while and then it kind of self-corrects. And I think we will always have a certain percentage of people who are vegetarian or vegan in the population. And obviously I have no problem with that. I do not think that, however, that there's a long-term dramatic shift that will occur towards vegan diets. And in fact, most of the research in the United States is showing that there are more people that are willing to include some vegan food in their diet. So for example, there's this Meatless Mondays idea. And so people will not eat any meat on that day, on Monday. And that idea is more popular. And I think that's fine. I don't think that's going to have any negative health implications for humans to, reduce their, especially in America, people are eating plenty of meat. So, but I do not believe that there's any risk for farmers, because if you look at the success of someone like Gabe Brown, who has shown that having crops and agricultural, having in his agricultural system, having lots of diversity, lots of different kinds of animals, and Will Harris down in Bluffton, Georgia, White Oaks Pasture Farm as well. They are showing that the more complex and the more nature-based your system is, there's a tremendous amount of public interest and excitement, and not just in the farming and people in the agricultural community are super interested in what they're doing, but consumers are really excited to see and read about and hear about and to visit their farms and to learn about these farms that are actually modeling the complexity of nature. So I think there's actually a tremendous opportunity for farmers if they move in that direction to make their product more appealing to the mainstream consumer.
Well, we're almost out of time. You've made me feel really positive because it feels like most. By the way, I'm sorry that you can't see me. My camera on my iPad, I keep trying to turn it on and it won't accept. That's why I haven't retired and hidden away. But you've made me feel fantastic, actually, because I feel your lawyer's mind has gone right across the field, dealt with all the issues, and actually really answered the key questions in a really powerful way. And I would like to thank you on behalf of everyone listening to this. Such a shame you couldn't be physically with us, but you'll always be welcome to come over here. And we can have anybody who's watching this can have a little bit more of you tomorrow in the session on diets, which of course is directly related to a lot of what you've been sharing with us today. So have you got any final words for us?
Yes, thank you, Patrick. And I was hoping to be there as well and would be there if it hadn't been for what happened with COVID, but I am hoping to come in the summer, and I look forward to hearing from lots of people that were at this session, and hopefully to being in the UK this summer.
Great. Well, thank you everyone for your brilliant, sophisticated chat and questions. I feel as if we're on a sort of collaborative learning curve where we feed each other, and there's tough questions coming up and tough answers being given. And I think that's exactly the spirit of the conversation which needs to take place. No holds barred. Thank you for your courage, Nicolette, and we look forward to hearing more from you tomorrow.
Thank you, Patrick.